The barn door stood open just enough to let a slice of moonlight fall across the floor, and I knew before she turned around that something had broken. Rebecca had been my closest friend since we were 5 years old. We had walked the same road to school, worked the same cows in the cold morning hours, pressed our whispers together during church services that seemed to stretch forever. Now she was standing in her father's barn at midnight, her hands folded low against her stomach. When she finally turned to face me, her cheeks were wet and had been for hours. She said my name very quietly, and then she said she was 3 weeks late. I felt something drop beneath my feet. I knew exactly what those words meant in the world we lived in. I knew, even before either of us could speak it plainly, what was already beginning to move toward her. Standing there in the smell of hay and horses and cold night air, I understood that the girl I had grown up beside was about to be transformed into something else entirely. Because in the Amish community, an unmarried girl who becomes pregnant does not simply carry a child. She becomes a parable. A cautionary whisper passed between mothers and daughters for the rest of her life. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County and left when I was 24. What I witnessed inside that community is a story I spent years learning how to carry, and longer still learning how to tell. Let me explain something that took me a long time to fully absorb. In the world outside, an unplanned pregnancy is a private matter, something between a woman, her partner, her doctor, perhaps her family. In the Amish world, privacy of that kind does not exist. Your body is understood as belonging to the community. Your failures belong to the church. Your future belongs to the bishop. And when a girl's body begins to reveal what the community calls sin before she has stood before the congregation and spoken her vows, every one of those forces moves at once, and none of them move gently. Here is what most people don't know. Premarital pregnancy in Amish communities is far more common than the image of plain life would suggest. The courtship practice known as bundling, where unmarried couples lie together in bed, produces exactly the outcome you would expect it to produce. Research into Amish communities has shown that rates of premarital pregnancy run significantly higher than in mainstream American life. Everybody inside the community knows this. Nobody says so directly. And what has developed over generations is a very precise system for managing it. A system that was about to close around my best friend. Rebecca was 19. The young man was Samuel, 22 years old, the second son of a family with a solid standing in the district. He had been bundling with her for 6 months. She had told me about him in stolen moments at quilting bees, her face flushed, her eyes carrying that particular brightness that belongs only to a girl who believes she is about to be chosen. She had been waiting for him to go to her father. She was wrong to wait. When Rebecca told her mother 3 days after she told me, the response was nothing like what you might expect. There was no shouting, no weeping. Her mother went perfectly still. She set down the bowl of green beans she had been snapping, walked to the bedroom without a word, and pulled the door closed behind her. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. When her mother finally came out, her face had been washed and she had put on a clean apron. She said 6 words. "We will speak to the bishop." That was the first stage. In our district, when a pregnancy outside of marriage was suspected, the bishop and 2 ministers would come to the family home. They would sit in the front room. The girl would be called in to stand before them. She would be required to confess, out loud, in specific detail, to 3 men she had known her entire life, men who had baptized her, men who had watched her learn to walk in this faith, men who would now determine what came next for her. Rebecca described that meeting to me afterward, and her hands trembled the whole time she spoke. They asked her who the father was. They asked how many times. They asked whether she had gone willingly. She had to answer every question. There was no one in the room to sit beside her, no advocate, no lawyer, no mother. Just Rebecca and 3 bearded men and the full weight of the community pressing down on her from every direction. This is where the system reveals what it actually is. After the confession comes the consequence, and the consequence has a name. The ban. a form of temporary excommunication. Rebecca was placed under it for 6 weeks. During that time, she could not sit at the table with her family. She ate alone at a small separate table in the corner of the kitchen while her parents and siblings shared their meals together. She could not receive anything directly from another person's hand. If her mother brought her a plate, it had to be set on the counter first and then picked up separately. She could not attend church. She could not be part of the youth gatherings. She could not be seen in public with anyone outside her immediate household. The bishop told her the purpose of all this was to bring her to genuine repentance, to let her feel what separation from the body of the community actually meant, so that when she was received back, she would not sin again. Rebecca told me those 6 weeks were the loneliest of her life. She said she would lie in bed at night listening to her family's voices coming through the wall, the ordinary sounds of conversation and laughter, and she felt like someone who had become invisible inside her own home. But the ban was only the first consequence. The permanent one came after. Samuel, the young man who had fathered the child, was also placed under the ban. He made his own confession. He sat through his own 6 weeks of separation. But what I watched happen to him was entirely different from what happened to Rebecca, and that difference broke something open in me that never fully closed again. The pressure applied to Samuel was aimed in one direction: marry her quickly. Within weeks, it was settled. There was no space to discuss whether the two of them actually wanted to build a life together, no consideration of whether they were ready, no acknowledgement that two people were being joined to one another by circumstance rather than choice. The pregnancy had determined their future. The bishop made the terms explicit. Samuel would marry her within the month, or he would face permanent excommunication. Samuel agreed. Of course he did. The price of refusal was his family, his land, his entire world. So, a wedding was arranged. But it was not the wedding Rebecca had imagined. Amish weddings are ordinarily grand and generous celebrations. 300 guests, a full day of feasting, hours of singing. The whole community gathered to bless and witness. Rebecca's wedding had 40 people. There was no celebratory meal, no singing. The ceremony took place on a Tuesday morning in her parents' front room and was finished in under an hour. She wore a dark blue dress rather than the new dress her mother would have sewn for her. There were no flowers. There was no joy. I stood at the back of that room and watched my closest friend marry a young man who hadn't sought her out of love, in front of a community that was not celebrating her, while carrying a baby whose arrival everyone in the room was silently calculating. Rebecca did not cry during the ceremony. I think by then she had simply run out of tears. The years that followed were harder to witness than I have words for. Rebecca and Samuel moved into a small daughter house on his family's property. The baby, a healthy little girl they named Anna, arrived 7 months after the wedding. Rebecca loved that child with everything she had. But the marriage itself was a wound that never closed over. Samuel was not unkind, but he was not in love with her, and she could feel the difference every day. He had been pressed into a life he hadn't asked for, and he carried that knowledge quietly through the years, not with cruelty, but with a kind of absence. He went through the motions. He worked long days. He ate. He slept. He treated Rebecca as an obligation rather than a partner. The community's treatment of her followed a similar pattern. Even after the ban was lifted and she was formally restored to fellowship, there was something on her that didn't wash clean. At quilting bees, the older women's conversations would shift when she came in. At church, certain families quietly steered their daughters away from her. Her name became a word mothers used to warn their teenage girls: "Don't become Rebecca." She heard versions of that warning trailing behind her for the rest of her time in the community. And Anna, that innocent child who had done nothing at all, would grow up in the long shadow of her mother's history. The arithmetic was never forgotten. Everyone had counted. Everyone knew. I want to be clear about something. Rebecca's story is not exceptional. It is not the story of a girl who fell through some unusual crack in the community structure. This is the structure. The bishop's visit, the forced confession, The ban. The coerced marriage. The stain that never fully lifts. This is the standard procedure. Before I left, I knew at least 4 other girls in my district alone who moved through some version of this same sequence. Each of them carried an identical look. The look of someone who understood that a single moment at 19 had been allowed to settle every question about the rest of her life. But there is something else that doesn't get spoken, and it is the part that still sits heavy with me in the quiet hours. There is another path some Amish girls take when the shame grows larger than they can hold. They leave before anyone finds out. They pack what they can carry. They walk to the nearest road. They find an English driver willing to take them somewhere. And they disappear. They turn up at homeless shelters, at crisis pregnancy centers, at the doors of relatives who left the community years before and haven't been spoken of since. They walk away from everything they have ever known because they cannot face what is coming. I knew a girl named Lydia who made that choice. She slipped out in the middle of the night with $70 folded into her apron pocket. Her family told the community she had gone to visit relatives in Ohio. She never returned. The last I heard, she was waitressing in Cleveland and raising her son on her own. Her parents have never held their grandchild. After I left the community, I spent years in therapy working through what I had witnessed. My therapist asked me once why Rebecca's story had lodged itself so deeply in me, given that it hadn't happened to me directly. I sat with that question for a long time before the answer came. It was because Rebecca's story was the first moment I truly understood what my world was. Before her, I believed the community was good. I believed the rules were just. I believed the bishop was wise and the structure was in place to protect people. After standing in that barn, and then in that front room, and then at the back of that dim Tuesday wedding, I could not return to believing any of it. I had watched a 19-year-old girl lose her future, her dignity, and her ability to choose, all in the name of preserving the community's sense of purity. And I had watched the young man who had been equally present in that situation receive something far lighter in return, because in the world I grew up in, a man's transgression was always understood as smaller than a woman's. The theology underneath all of it is something I have turned over many times. The community would tell you that the ban is an act of love, that the forced marriage protects the child, that the reputation a woman carries afterward is simply the natural result of sin. They would reach for scripture about discipline and consequence and the importance of communal accountability. I am not here to argue anyone's theology, but I will say this plainly. There is no definition of love that requires a teenage girl to describe the most intimate moments of her life to 3 men sitting in judgment. There is no form of protection that consists of binding 2 young people together in a marriage neither of them freely chose and asking them to sustain it for 60 years. There is no version of grace that falls more heavily on the woman than on the man who was present for the same act. Rebecca is 41 years old now. She still lives in Lancaster County. She and Samuel had 4 more children after Anna. They are still married. If you drove past her life from the outside, it would look like every other Amish woman's life. The cooking, the gardening, the church attendance, the rhythm of seasons and duties. But 3 years ago, I came back to the area for a funeral, and we managed to meet briefly and secretly at a coffee shop, because being seen with a shunned woman would have brought consequences down on her. We sat together for 2 hours, and just before she stood to leave, she reached across the table and took my hand, and she said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said she loved her children and would not trade them for anything in this world. And then she said she wanted me to know something else. She said the girl she had been at 19, the girl who walked into that bishop's meeting, that girl had died in that room. Whoever she was now, she said, she was not her. And she never got to find out who that girl might have become. Then she left. And I sat in that coffee shop and cried for a long time. Rebecca did not get to choose her husband. She did not get to choose her wedding. She did not get to choose what her life became. But she chose what she said to me at that table. And in saying it, she made sure her story would not remain buried in silence. So I am telling it now because she would want it told. Because somewhere tonight there is a young Amish girl who is 3 weeks late and frightened and standing somewhere in the dark trying to understand what is about to happen to her. She deserves to know that what is coming is not love. It is not justice. It is not God's design. It is a system. And systems can be questioned. Systems can be walked away from. Systems can be survived. If this story reached something in you, something you have carried alone, share it. Tell someone who needs to hear that they are not alone in it. The cost of that system has always been paid by women who were too young to see it coming and given no tools to fight back. That cost is real, and it deserves to be named.